I have memories of going to competitions and being the only Black person there. That was definitely intimidating because I would always feel like, hey, maybe I'm not meant to be here. I started playing music when I was little, like basically when I was born. My mother's a violin teacher. My sister plays violin, so it was just kind of a natural thing for me. I don't know what I would be doing in my life if it weren't cello.
it's important not just to play the notes, but to be able to communicate a feeling to the audience. Because if I were sitting in the audience, I would like to see a show, a performance, and be impressed and be sad and happy at the same time, and walk out feeling like that was the full package. So you can't just enjoy one part of your music. You have to keep moving on, and that's what the audience wants, is to be able to enjoy a wide range of emotions.
A leader is someone whose actions inspire others to do better.
A great leader creates a culture of self-empowerment and confidence so that those around them feel that they could actually lead themselves.
Someone who's not afraid of championing others' success.
Acting with graceful risk and just generally setting a good example for people.
A leader is fearless.
Using your talents to make the world a better place and encouraging others to do the same.
Creating a space for others to thrive and be the best they can be.
Seeing beyond themselves, they act not for their own gain, but for the greater good of all humanity.
Inspires, motivates, and sets the best example.
The commitment to thoughtful collaboration and creating a sum that is greater than its parts.
Leadership means walking in somebody else's shoes.
A leader helps others rise.
You're broken down and tired of living life on a merry-go-round, and you can't find a fighter, but I see it in you, so we gon' walk it out. Ooh, mountains, we gon' walk it out. Mountains, and I'll rise like the day. I'll rise unafraid. I'll rise up, and I'll do it 1,000 times again. And I'll rise up high like the waves. I'll rise up in spite of the ache. I'll rise up, and I'll do it 1,000 times again. And when the silence isn't quiet and it feels like it's getting hard to breathe, and I know you feel like dying, but I promise you we'll help you get to your feet. Ooh, mountains will help you get to your feet. Move mountains, and I'll rise up. I'll rise like the day. I'll rise up. I'll rise unafraid. I'll rise up, and I'll do it 1,000 times again. For you, for you, I'll rise
Good evening, everyone. And welcome to SphinxConnect 2019 Leaders Rising. It is such a joy and with so much gratitude that I look into this room to 800, some of us, some in the hallway, some in the audience. We're still gathering. And I really couldn't be more thankful to welcome everyone here from far and wide. We have everything from Detroit to Iowa to Germany, Amsterdam, all over the place. It's just so terrific to have everyone here. And before we go any farther, I just want you to remember a few names of people who've really brought all of this together. And as we spend the rest of the week and the weekend together, I just want you to remember these names on my team who put this conference together and who also put together the Sphinx competition, the results for which we just heard this morning and the afternoon. I want to recognize Abigail Venman, she is hiding, but that's our Senior Director for Arts Leadership who oversees all of arts leadership programming and chiefly this conference, and none of this would have been possible without her efforts. I also want to give a shout out to Dana Magar, our Director of Artist Engagement, who oversees the Sphinx competition, and both of the orchestras. And Andre Dowell, who I'm sure is also hiding somewhere, but that's our Chief Programming Officer, who throughout the year works tirelessly to oversee all of our incredible programs, reaching more than 10,000 young people throughout the year. These are the people who make all of this possible. And everyone else on my full-time team and the support team that comes together from all over the country to really produce all of this. I want to thank them. So just a few words before we move on to our feature. My late father, probably the most influential figure in my life, comes from a small immigrant community of Persian Jews living in a historically Muslim environment. Both of my parents did what they could to preserve the culture in which adults conversed, and as they conversed, they would always start by asking, "How are the children?" That didn't actually mean you need to have children or actually know whether the person you're speaking to has children or has any intention to have children. It just meant as an adult, if you're conversing, there's probably children somewhere in your tribe, somewhere in your neighborhood, in your community. And if you're well enough to stand there, you're probably well enough to take care of them. So in my immediate Sphinx family, La Familia, we often think of leadership that way. We start with children. We think about questioning their well-being, the youngest members of our community, and whether our work is having enough of an impact to help make their lives a little bit better, a little more just and more fair. And when I think of leadership, in my view, it is caring for and empowering others. As I reflect upon those who still struggle to have access to safe, clean water in Flint, Michigan, where we teach every week, and to those families who pray that there will be enough resources to put food on the table, I stand in awe and admiration of the fortitude and leadership of those who care for them, our teaching artists. Our children are the leaders of tomorrow, and they are rising today. I see leadership unfolding when I think of David Krawczyk, who started as a student in our inaugural year of our Overture program in Flint and has now returned to be one of our teaching specialists. I think of Alex Way, once a student at our Preparatory Music Institute and now more recently an administrative fellow at Sphinx, having received the Kresge Artist Fellowship. I think of Ifetayo Ali-Landing, whom you heard earlier today, who started in our Sphinx Performance Academy, one of our preparatory programs, came back to win the junior division of the Sphinx competition, or Sterling Elliott, a graduate of the Sphinx Performance Academy, now leading the way as one of the youngest musicians to ever sub with the New York Philharmonic. Our work is not without its challenges. Our mission still, believe it or not, requires convincing of some, but as I look around this room, I'm filled with pride for this community, for this family, and for countless young leaders who are rising each and every day. As many of you know, at Sphinx, our work is a pipeline. It looks at creative youth development, pre-professional training, and then artistic leadership. This past year, Sphinx joined forces to lead the way with our partners nationwide, the League of American Orchestras, the New World Symphony, and the Mellon Foundation, along with a group of incredible, wise, dedicated musicians who are advising us. We aspire together to create a program that will build unprecedented support and a training system for musicians in pursuit of orchestral careers. Today, I am proud to cite the leadership of 43 orchestras around the country who have also joined forces with us and committed their own resources and themselves as partners to this room. But that's not enough. I also see each and every person in this room as a critical and necessary partner who can help move the great stagnant needle forward and decisively change the mindset of our entire field. Most recently, with the support of the Knight Foundation and in partnership with the Cleveland Institute of Music, Curtis Institute of Music, the New World Symphony Orchestra, and the Juilliard School, and under the leadership of our own Stanford Thompson, a member of the Sphinx Symphony and a recipient of the Sphinx Medal of Excellence, we launched Sphinx Lead, a new program designed to change the landscape of administrative leadership in our field by empowering the most promising leaders of color. Our leaders are rising as young entrepreneurs, as administrative leaders, as performing artists, and as teachers. I say we must rise together with them so that others can stand upon our shoulders, much as we stood upon those who came before us, like our founder, Aaron Dworkin, here with us today, who often spoke about making a difference through the work of others. So, as managers, let us change our hiring practices. As recruiters, let's set authentic and different priorities. As teachers, let us together choose different repertoire to pass on to our children. As programmers or presenters, we can insist upon good art by good artists who deserve to be heard. As administrators or advocates, we can set rhetoric aside now, step out of the way, and empower other brilliant ideas which may not be our own. I aspire to do the same thing with you today and every day, and I myself have a very long way to go. But we are each other's keepers, and we can keep each other honest. We are the exact people who have the power to go beyond a nod, beyond a handshake, beyond that consensus building, directly into action. I'm thinking of the saying that a candle does not lose its flame by lighting another. So for those of us in some position of influence, let us not miss another opportunity to spread that light, to give others the spotlight, and go not just 1, but 10 steps farther than talk, and keep the momentum moving boldly forward. It is now my honor to join you in turning the spotlight to our opening plenary speaker. A noted social historian, award-winning author, and educational leader, he is the director of the new University of Michigan Center for Social Solutions. Also a professor of history and Afroamerican Studies, he is president emeritus of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. At Michigan, his area of work encompasses 3 core aspects of social concern: diversity and race, water, and the dignity of labor in an automated world. Prior to returning to Michigan and before leading the Mellon Foundation, he served as the Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs and Provost at Emory University, as well as the Asa Griggs Professor of History and African American Studies. As a scholar and a leader in higher education and in philanthropy, he has examined and addressed critical questions for our society, including the role of race in American history, diversity, equity, inclusion, graduate education, humanities scholarship, and universities and their broader communities. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a hearty welcome back to the state of Michigan and a true Sphinx Familia welcome to Professor EARL Lewis.
Good evening, everyone. Let's try that again. After all that music and all, I know there's more energy in this room. Good evening. Good evening. There we go. That sounds more like Michigan and Detroit. It is truly a pleasure to be here. And I want to thank Arthur Dworkin and the entire Sphinx organization for inviting me to speak tonight. It is wonderful to be back in Michigan, here in Detroit, and speaking to men and women, young and not so young, who have dedicated their lives to the arts. Let me begin by saluting you for all you do to bring surprise and beauty, intellectual verve, and pure emotional delight to audiences large and small. In a country so visibly polarized along economic, religious, racial, and other lines, the arts create a space where difference can be examined, displayed, debated, and recognized. That's tremendous work. And this work, as I will suggest in a few minutes, that will grow only in importance in the years ahead. Now, my relationship with Sphinx spans 20 years. I was reminding Aaron of this a few minutes ago. And in fact, 2 of the last 3 organizations I have had the pleasure of leading have been involved with Sphinx. Nearly 20 years ago, Aaron Dworkin came to visit me in my office at the Rackham School of Graduate Studies at the University of Michigan, where I then served as dean. And he came to seek my help in supporting an organization he called Sphinx. It was new, I was new, and I dare say Aaron was younger. That said, there was no mistaking his vision, passion, leadership. That word leadership. Leaders rising, leaders have always been important as we try to actually imagine a new possibility in our world. Implicit in Aaron's message to me then in office today is an understanding of the interplay among diversity, opportunity, and prosperity. If you start with the assumption that talent is evenly distributed across the globe, but access to opportunity is not, then how can you conclude that the country's orchestral members, theater groups, dance troupes, and other artistic forms are the very best? If they represent one gender, one race, or disproportionately 1 or 2 ethnic groups. In fact, as Scott Page has argued in the recent book, The Diversity Bonus, and others have echoed, the more complicated the task or problem to be solved, the greater dividend or bonus when you deploy a diverse set of actors. Now, this may sound counterintuitive in the art world, but it's not. Would you want an orchestra, an ensemble made up of players who train only at one institution? Juilliard, maybe? Sitting here in Detroit, my colleagues at the University of Michigan School of Music would most certainly scream, no way. But I guess they would be joined by Curtis alums or folks from Indiana University, or you name the institution. So let's probe this a bit more. Why not the same people from the same place? First, there's education and training. Schools and teachers have approaches and preferences. They transfer to students who become performers and later teachers. Second, admission to certain schools may be determined in part by the kind of preparation received as a teenager. Did you, for instance, go to Interlochen? Did you receive ample and highly individualized, top-notch private training before college or the conservatory? Here, so much is shaped by the accident of birth. They had you born into one family, in one place, at one time, rather than another. Should that be the final arbiter of opportunity? Let's hope not. When Sphinx burst onto the scene in circa 1998 or so, by its own assessment, African Americans and Latinx professionals accounted for just 2.7% of orchestral members, broadly speaking. By 2016, that number had grown to 4.3%. Progress to be sure, but what's an acceptable goal? When and how do we declare victory, partial or full? Now, most demographers predict a non-white majority in the United States by 2044, with much of the racial and ethnic diversity occurring along the coast, East, Gulf, and West. Outside of major cities and metropolitan areas, the interior of the country will remain overwhelmingly white. This suggests two Americas, one on the periphery that is diverse and hopefully inclusive, and one on the interior that may, and I emphasize the word may, be more inward-looking and without question, less diverse. This demographic transformation will come on the heels of a more profound alteration. McKinsey issued a report a year ago that predicted the disappearance of 800 million jobs worldwide by 2030. These were jobs that existed in 2015, but are no longer in existence 11 years from now. Roughly 54 million of those lost jobs will come here in the United States. That's 1/3 of our contemporary workforce. For a long time, it has been assumed that the hardest hit would be folks in the delivery sectors, long-distance truck drivers, cabbies, limo drivers, and the like. And no question, those industries will be hard hit. But an article in last week's New York Times captured that no sector is robot-proof. The article is entitled "The Hidden Automation Agenda of the Davos Elite." In the piece, Kevin Roos goes on to assert, those gathered at the World Economic Forum seem to say one thing in public and another in private. In private, they seem to convey anything and everything that can be automated will be automated. Now, this is not entirely new, of course. I recall an executive of one of the big three accounting firms telling a group of public company directors some 3 years ago that her firm was betting on the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution, which foresaw the melding of the biological, digital, and mechanical into new devices and new opportunities. Of course, no one knows for sure if the McKinsey's prediction will occur on the schedule its analysts have suggested. And their predictions do not take into account the creation of new jobs. But those predictions put us on alert. Millions of Americans and millions of world citizens are at risk of being discarded as we move deeper into the 21st century. Growing diversity and growing obsolescence are on parallel courses. If we don't do something, the lines will converge with profound economic, social, medical, and political consequences. We think the opioid crisis is intense. Imagine for a moment a generation making the transition from adolescence to adulthood, unable to answer the question, what do you do? What do you do? Some, of course, champion a universal basic income. This strikes me as part of the solution, but not the entire answer. This brings us back to the theme of tonight's talk, embracing diversity to ensure prosperity. Through art, we can see the world we have and project the one we seek to create. Creativity cannot be easily automated. It derives from the individual and combined genius of the human imagination. A more diverse and perhaps stressed America must tap the depths of the creative reservoir to help redefine what it means to be human in an automated and digital world. Through your role as artists, art administrators, art leaders, you have to become students of life in an automated world. You have to read widely and analyze deeply. And you also have to produce music, dramas, stories, dances that offer answers to the question, can we have a prosperous society that doesn't make full use of the range of human talents? Thus, those who argue, wait, the coming diversity explosion will take care of today's issues, fail to understand the patterns. Moreover, nearly 40 years of work shows some things don't change without human intervention. leaders rising. Orchestras didn't achieve greater gender balance because more women entered conservatories. The conservatories and orchestras needed a plan. Your challenge is thus your opportunity. As early as 1990, Lorraine P. Wilson noted in her dissertation that change across the landscape rested on reasonable recruiting strategies and practices. She wrote, and I quote, "Recruiting strategies include outreach programs, pre-college programs, linkages with elementary and secondary schools, faculty, staff, and alumni involvement, and flexible criteria for admission." Yet, given the numbers noted earlier, knowledge and proper diagnosis of the problem is no substitute for effective leadership. Ownership of the change you seek is the first order of business. Here, I note, if everyone is accountable, then no one is accountable. If everyone is accountable, then no one is accountable. When orchestras sought to expand opportunities for female musicians, the blind audition was adopted. In this instance, individual orchestras and symphonies owned the change being sought. They designed the format, polices enforcement, praises outcomes, and challenged others to replicate their success. If the goal is to produce a greater racial and ethnic diversity to accompany greater gender diversity, where do you begin? Who owns it? Sphinx? The League of Orchestras? El Sistema? The Inner City Youth Orchestra of Los Angeles? This is a systems question that requires a system solution. And this is the work you've been at and the work I think you'll have to continue to be at. Of course, you must always address the pipeline. Without exposure at an early age to music, private tutoring, and enrichment opportunities, the number of students available for entry into the leading conservatories and music schools will remain woefully inadequate. But it's not just exposure. When casting a wider net in search for talent, one invariably encounters other factors that play a role in a candidate's ultimate success. For youngsters whose family lacks considerable disposable income, there's of course the price of extra instruction. And as some in this room can attest, there's peer pressure, positive and negative, an information gulf between students from less privileged backgrounds and those from privileged backgrounds, regardless of color. And there's a much broader social trope. What are you going to do with that? Art making of any kind is always suspect. Seeing at an early age that you aspire to become a professional musician or artist generally will certainly stretch the imagination of family and friends more often than is acknowledged. Even if you gain the training, complete a pre-collegiate course of study, and build a sterling resume, the competition for entry into the right music program can be intense. Here, contemporary data tell a striking story. As I told an audience in Baltimore a few years ago, Juilliard and Curtis have among the lowest acceptance rates of any post-secondary institution in the nation. In 2014, Juilliard's was 8.4% and Curtis's was 4.8%. And this was lower than Stanford and Harvard. Stanford was 5.1% that year, and Harvard was 6%. For the Harvard graduates in the room, it's starting to look easier to get into Harvard. Those limitations are reflected in other outcomes. According to the data from 2012, across all degree fields, 1,015 individuals graduated degrees in music performance from Berkeley, Cleveland Institute of Music, Curtis, Indiana University, Northwestern, Oberlin, and Juilliard. And when you start looking at the numbers and breaking them down, a quarter of the students were non-resident, 243. Half were white, 552. A tenth were Asian, 99. And African Americans and Latinx individuals each accounted for less than 3%, 24 and 34 graduates, respectively. There's work here to be done. Now, let's be clear. And I'm sure no one in this room is calling for lower standards or retreat from a commitment to excellence. And in fact, I think it's an old canard that I wish would one day go away, that somehow says that diversity and excellence are somehow incompatible. Excavating the assumption about what constitutes talent is part of the process, but not the entire solution, obviously. While every program may insist it has an interest in promoting and furthering diversity, too often it is accomplished in a siloed manner without significant scaling. Of course, there are examples of diversity programs in the orchestral world. The Baltimore Symphony Orchestra has the Orchestra Fellows Program, which is a one-year fellowship for a string player from an underrepresented community. The Detroit Symphony Orchestra has created the African American Fellowship Program, which aims to support one fellow in the instrument for 1 to 2 years. And the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra has created an orchestra training program for African American musicians that supports one fellow in the instrument for 2 years. Similarly, a number of orchestras and symphonies have introduced pathway programs, these developmental programs to help to increase diversity. So it is not the case that we don't have or haven't begun to craft solutions. In fact, many of you probably know about the Boston Symphony Project STEP, designed to prepare K-12 musicians from underrepresented communities to pursue musical careers. And I suspect others of you know about the Eastman School's Pathway Program. In this program, students in between the 5th and the 12th grades who are in the Rochester City schools begin instrumental instruction in their city schools and then are eligible for the Pathway Program as they advance through the school system. Up to 70 students participate each year in Pathways. And for any Pathway student who gains admission to Eastman, a full scholarship awaits. It would be a mistake, however, to suggest that the growing number of performers is the extent of the work. Presenting old and new work from diverse artists is just as important. Using art to speak to the world of change I earlier outlined is as well. Partnering with high schools, colleges, and universities to teach all students about the role and place of the arts is critical. And during the Q&A, we can talk about some of those examples. And the work is not yours alone. As I noted in my final report as president of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, philanthropy has to encourage and support more genuine risk-taking. In my view, the best private foundations perceive of themselves as intellectual venture capitalists, professing a willingness to invest in sound ideas and projects, no matter how novel, zany, or inexperienced the proposer. If we only fund the sure thing, the most venerated, the most mature, we might make progress, but we will fail. We will fail to secure path-breaking advancement. Now, in doing this, might we fail at times? I was a rare philanthropist when I would say, I surely hope so. We learn from failure just as much as we learn from success. So if the issue is developing a pipeline, models exist. If the need is for the pipeline to produce pathways, models exist. The real question is there the will and the determination to do something significant? In a future characterized by the ubiquity of robots, in which everything that can be automated will be automated, creative genius may become the determining characteristic of a prosperous world. The arts, music, literature, drama, dance, acting, storytelling, and more may become the way we understand what it means to be a connected human and what we come to understand as truly prosperous. Our best chance of doing so depends, in my view, on defining, valuing, and leveraging diversity for the prosperity of all. That is our opportunity, and that is surely my hope. Your role is so important, so important. Please embrace it with vigor. I want to thank you. I want to thank Sphinx for all that it has done over the years and continues to do to showcase how promoting diversity is in everyone's interest and how doing so helps to produce a more prosperous world. And in the end, I salute you all. You are indeed leaders rising. Thank you.
Great. So we now have a few moments for a rigorous, vigorous Q&A session with Professor Lewis. And we will do both Slido as well as please feel free to find your way toward the microphone and I'll help facilitate.
Yeah, let's get
Let's
the mic.
turn it on, that'll help.
I think there's a technician somewhere in the house.
It's not me.
Can I just speak louder? Oh, that sounds good. Okay, this question? No?
Nope.
Oh. Can you hear me now?
Absolutely. Great. We have liftoff.
We'll be alternating questions between Slido and questions from the microphone. So please
Okay.
do send them in at slido.com, #SphinxConnect. So this one is from Slido. What are the biggest roadblocks towards diversity in ensemble management?
No doubt there are probably 2 or 3 factors at play. One is actually understanding what that means for a young person coming up. And so when we think about management and think about where there are opportunities, I dare say that in most schools that I visit, if you put up a list of job opportunities, ensemble management would not actually be on anyone's screen. And so that says something about how we think about where there are possibilities. And so that there's the biggest hurdle may be just pure knowledge and experience and ways of actually knowing about what's available there. And so that's one. The second piece of this is also then going out and explaining once you're even told, then how do you actually then find an opportunity in that field, in that world, and what it means to manage any kind of group, be it a musical group or not. I mean, it's not always taught at music schools. And then if you're talking about this ensemble management, I mean, and what do you mean by that? I would say those are 3 things that one can begin to imagine, and be interesting whoever asked the question. If it's the real hard part about when you get it off a Slido, I can't ask questions back. Because usually I would then ask a clarifying question. So exactly what did you mean by this? And so I'll leave it there. So what else do you have?
Here's another one from Slido.
And I know a few people in this room, so if you don't ask me questions, I'll ask you questions.
How specifically do you propose that diversity ensures prosperity? And this is a 2-parter. How will that combat the loss of jobs through automation?
Very good question. So if you think about opportunity in America, who has and how do one actually go about figuring out what jobs? And so three ways you can actually imagine it. One is that we begin to actually think now about the dignity of work. And how do we begin to define what we mean by work in the future? And what kind of work? And is it the work that we've actually thought of as part of the 18th and 19th going into the 20th century, where it's manual labor? But is work also then the intellectual work that can come by actually bringing people together to look at problems at the community level, on the block level, on the street? That too is a kind of work. And so that kind of work actually then has a resonance among individuals because they actually thinking about the immediate benefit. That's a way to actually imagine a new way of mobilizing human capital to improve the world. And that's one example. And you need it then because what all the studies will show, if it's only the people from that block working on an answer to that question, they may not actually come up with the best solution. It's the ability to actually then bring in a diverse set of perspectives that actually assist us all in moving forward and coming up with solutions that actually are enduring. Aaron.
Thank you again for spending this time with us.
Yeah.
Deeply appreciated. In all of the work that you've done and the research that you've seen, are there any specific examples of things that have occurred that have been done in other fields that have significantly impacted diversity or inclusion that we have not done in the arts, and that you think if we were to, we could potentially really move the needle more significantly?
Thank you for that question. there are examples. Part of it is about time and how we actually approach the time question. And so the example I used to use when I was president of the Mellon Foundation was about a scholarship program we started through Mellon, the Mellon Mays program. If you look at the timeline over almost 30 years, you realize that had that program actually ended after 5 years or after 10 years, you would have said it was a failure. It took 15 to 20 years of compounding to actually begin to see the effects and to be able to say you went from 5 graduates to 700 graduates, and those 700 graduates, now there are 400 folks who have gone on to earn PhDs or who are in tenure or tenure-track positions across the United States. But it's a different timeline than you see in almost any place. Corporations tend to be cycled by the quarter. And so they're looking at profit margins by the quarter, and they have to report out to directors and to shareholders. And so they're trying to figure out how they're going to answer that question at the end of 4 quarters, not necessarily the end of 20 quarters, let alone at the end of 60 quarters. And so there's different ways. And so that piece, you get some results in a corporate setting, but you don't get the same results that you may get in an educational setting. In the field of music, I mean, what you started 20 years ago, no doubt you begin now to actually see the compounding effects. 10 years ago, you wouldn't have seen it because, in fact, you're still building the capacity. And it takes 20, 30 to 40 years. And we live in a world where I grew up, when I was born in Virginia in 1955, a generation was 25 years. And now in the digital world, a generation is 18 months. And you sort of think of the difference between analog time and digital time. And that tension between then wanting change immediately in a world that's still partly anchored in an analog time is part of the challenge we also have to work through.
This question is from Evander from Orchestra of St. Luke's.
Yes.
Could you elaborate a bit more on risk-taking with philanthropy, and what does that look like?
Yes, I mean, I say this to a group of my colleagues. They said, "Earl, you're walking out the door, you say it now." And so it was probably true, and it just took me 5 years to understand that this was an issue. I actually think we should set aside, I mean, most philanthropy should set aside something they purely think of as risk capital, and where you take X% off the top each year, and you look at it and says, we're going to spend 10% on things that we realize may not pay off in 5 years, 10 years, if ever. But that's sort of part of the intellectual risk-taking. And so as I was imagining this, is that the way the IRS works and the way our tax laws works, then private philanthropy is by law supposed to give away 5% on a rolling average of their capital. But the compounding effects over a period of time is that usually you're growing at 12% and you're giving away 5%, so your corpus continues to grow. So why not pull off 10%? And actually use that for something that is quite different, quite risky, but actually then may actually help that small new organization that doesn't fit into a category because it doesn't check all the boxes in terms of having a strong financial arm, being able to show that it has a management team that has 15 years of experience, being able to show that, and you sort of go down the list for those of you who actually submitted grants. How do we begin to think newly, in a new way, about what it means to actually encourage that kind of risk-taking? And philanthropy should actually lead the way, in my view. It has the resources.
Hello.
Hi there.
You talked a little bit about access and the pathways universities and institutions are making by offering lessons and maybe offering instruments and that sort of thing. I was wondering how access to people and networking works in like the younger scale, because I'm a composer now, and as a musician, you would take a lesson, but and play and get to know your professor, but in composition, it's really more subjective than how your music sounds, because everyone's sound is so different.
Yeah. I mean, we can dialogue back and forth, but stay at the mic for a second.
Okay.
So how did you come to become a composer?
I started out as a violinist and then a violist, and I I went to Interlochen,
Yeah.
and I took some composition classes, and that's how I started through that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is exposure, right? I mean, that's sort of part of your own autobiography, that you have one way of being introduced to music and the music world. And along the way, you try something else, and that sort of widens your lens of what's possible. And then you may discover you like it. And in fact, you may like one a little better than you like the other. And it gets you up in the morning at 5 o'clock, and you go, all right, I used to get up at 5:30 to practice, but now my mind is actually someplace else, and I'm beginning to sort of turn on those creative juices in a different kind of way. Part of it is what you're suggesting, though, is exposure, too. And it's to know that those courses exist, that it is possible, that you can make not only a living, but actually be that intellectual worker in a different way than just being a performer. And that performance provides you with one outlet, composing another. I used to say to my students, my graduate students years ago, they asked me why you would write an essay. And I said, well, I do it for a reason. They said, what's that? I said, it's going to sound not so humble. I said, but every time I write something, I know I have a little claim on immortality. And that means somewhere it's going to be recorded in an archive. It's going to be left around. It's going to be little dust tracks that said, I was there. Composing allows you to leave those little dust tracks too, that I was there. It's a different way of actually establishing yourself in the world. And so being able to explain that to a young person is how do you actually want to make sure that when you're no longer here, someone has a way to say, but they were there. There was an extraordinary performance that is recorded, and we can listen to it and we can see it. Or there's a composition that we have found, and now we're trying to play it and understand it. Different ways of saying you were there.
Returning to the topic of philanthropy.
Yes.
For those of us who are in the position to be asking for philanthropic support, and in the case of philanthropists who might not be as excited to be innovative as you described, is there a way that we can present the value proposition to them or help incentivize them? Are there words we can say?
I love that. Both in the United States now, in China and now in Detroit, someone said to me once, are there words I can use that actually will help me make my case? I think part of it is being authentic. You start there. You have something that you're trying to convey. What I learned years ago, before I was a philanthropist for 5 years. I spent the other 30 years on the other side of the table asking for money. And I'm doing it again now, so I'm sort of come full circle. And part of it is that you have to believe in what you are about. What I could always tell is when someone walked into an office and they had 5 ideas, but they didn't know which one was most important. And if they couldn't tell me which one was most important, I wasn't going to fund any of them. It's true. Because they had to make a claim to tell me, this is, of all the things that I could possibly do, this is the thing that matters the most. And here's why. And sometimes it took 2 or 3 or 4 conversations. I can remember before I was president of the Mellon Foundation, going to Mellon and asking for money once. And one of the senior program officers turned me down. And I just looked at her and I said, did I come too early? And I said, I like this idea, and you're going to like it too by the end. And 3 years later, she funded me. Because sometimes you introduce an idea where it is too early. And you have to be prepared. And so part of it is also thinking about your own timeline. Is this a project that has to be completed in the next 6 months? Or is this something that you realize that you got a 5-year window and you really need it by year 3? And you're asking in year 1, you may or may not hit it in year 1. And so that's the other piece, is then being very conscious about the timeline for what you're trying to achieve, because that too is understood. And then the last piece is actually, how do you say it? being willing to date more than one foundation. It's that just because one turns you down doesn't mean that another will always turn you down, because they may see something there that someone else didn't. And so part of it is also being willing to actually go around and talk to as many people as you think possible who may have some general interest in what you're doing. There's no special word. It's all about human relationships. I mean, it really is. And believing in what you're doing. And then basically selling it. Saying it's not just selling, but you're asking them to co-invest. You're already investing. And you're looking for a co-investor. And if they take a chance on you and invest, here's the return. You're going to make a difference and change the world in this way. Those actually are sort of basic pieces, and my colleagues in many different settings respond to it. Maybe not always the first time around or the second time around, but in the end, they do hear it. And each time you're making a case because you've done a little bit more with what you're trying to achieve.
How do we make sure that opportunities are shared equitably across the country instead of only large metropolitan areas?
That is really an important question, and I actually think it's one that will one that will challenge us over the next decade to 2 to 3. Income inequality and wealth inequality has been extreme in the last 20 years, and is most acute in major metropolitan areas where we have the consolidation of capital, both at the individual level and at the institutional level. But a lot of people live in other parts of the country, and so being able to go out and visit and spend some time, that's why when I gave the stats about McKinsey, and McKinsey studied that 800 million jobs worldwide, 54 million in the United States, 1/3 of the contemporary American workforce could lose their jobs by 2030. That's profound. And that will be all across this nation, but mostly in smaller places where they have not been able to adapt to the new technologies and industries. And it will hit different communities differently. In a more recent study by McKinsey, of the 700,000 long-distance truck drivers, African Americans are overrepresented. 150, 160,000 of the truck drivers are African American. That means when those jobs go away, that working middle class job will disappear, and it will be spread across communities, but it will be disproportionately felt in those communities. How do we begin now to talk about that and think about what's the alternative? So that my institution, the University of Michigan, is not only designing the new technologies, it's thinking about the implications for those folks who will be displaced by those technologies. But it's not just in the big city. I mean, that's not just in the small cities and towns. I was in San Francisco in September and had the most profound moment of recognition. Walking down Market Street, there were thousands of fellow Americans sleeping on the streets in San Francisco. I mean, thousands. I had never seen that many people congregating on streets anywhere in an American city in the last, I'm 63, so in the last 50-some years of my life. Off of Market Street, on a street called Samsung, was the juxtaposition of our current past and the future, because there was a coffee shop. There was a coffee stand. The coffee stand was being run by a robot. And so there was this robotic barista with people, I have it on my phone, with people queuing up. And so you had the juxtaposition of a world in change and with the human discard, and where we allow thousands of Americans to live on the streets without an adequate solution there. So it's not just the small towns, big cities too. And it's not just in this country, it's all over the world. Susan.
Hi, all. One of the impediments to achieving diversity in orchestras is that management does not control either hiring or termination by and large, and that most musicians get tenure very quickly. I'm wondering, from your position in academia and your familiarity with tenure, what you're thinking about embracing diversity while maintaining tenure.
Yeah, no, And as you know, I've had not just one role in academia, but I've been a dean and a provost, and on different days I've had different views on tenure. So true confession. We may find ourselves in a whole range of institutions, including higher education institutions, where the tenure system that made a whole lot of sense, certainly throughout much of the 20th century, may have to be changed. Now, this probably would be the most controversial thing I may say tonight, and I've said a few things that are controversial. I don't imagine that as we look at the ways in which higher education will be delivered in the United States over the next 40 to 50 years, that we already know we don't need as many tenure-track faculty as we did a generation ago. But we shouldn't replace that with contingent faculty either. And so what we're going to end up finding, I think, is a new hybrid where we're going to have term contracts that will go from 10 years to 15 years up to 30 years. And that these term contracts will define then an individual's relationship to his or her work. That may have implications for other sectors. I think as we look and just look at the ways in which I know the ed tech world is moving right now on the education side, that we won't be able to sustain this tenure model. And even venerable institutions. So this morning, or sometime today on the electronic version of the New York Times, there's this whole notion about Hampshire College, right? And for those who saw it, where Hampshire, which has this extraordinary reputation as one of the younger institutions in American higher ed, is now so financially strapped that it said it may not be able to accept a class for the fall of 2019. So we will have to begin to think as we look across the landscape, and as you, I don't know if you were in the audience, I once said to a group, you probably heard a group of college presidents that not all of their institutions were going to survive over the next 15 years. And at the end, I had a flood of people come and ask me, is it my institution? And I said, I can only give you the characteristics, and if you check here, I think I would be worried, but I don't know about your institution. And it's that way, I think, as we look, we have to ask, is it important for the institution to survive? And if so, do the current structures actually make sense? And if they don't, then we have to figure out how do we modify those structures. But we have to do so in such a way that we value humans and we value the work that they do. And so I think that's the tension sometimes between meeting the bottom line, ensuring diversity, and making sure that we're also sustainable. And I would say in the end, the final part really is at the crust of your question, which is any tenure committee that only sees fit to hire people who look like them should be replaced. Yes.
Good evening. Thanks so much for your talk.
Sure.
You mentioned in your speech earlier that if everybody is accountable, then no one's accountable.
Yeah.
And so in this kind of dilemma of trying to embrace diversity to ensure prosperity and all these things, who does hold the accountability? Who holds the burden a little bit more? Is it our educational institutions, and even in our arts fields? Is it our schools? Are we needing to delve more into that versus companies versus orchestras versus something like this?
I think higher ed actually has perhaps the greatest responsibility. I mean, education, both secondary and tertiary education, has an extraordinary responsibility. Because we are the places that young people should be able to have this little light go off in their heads that says, I can make this world better. I mean, when I was a provost, it came back to haunt me at one point when I said to a group of students, I count on you. And they said, what do you mean? I said, I count on you to believe that you can change the world. Because if an 18 to 22-year-old can't believe that he or she can change the world, then we're all in trouble. And so when they were occupying my office one day, I had a second thought on that, but but that was genuine too, and we had a nice conversation. But they believe, And I think this is the part where, in some ways, then yes, education probably has to be at the front of that list. But all institutions have to actually bear some responsibility. We live at a moment in American history where some question the legitimacy of all institutions. That's a problem. Because indeed, if the institutions disappear, what's to replace? Because then it becomes down to the world of the individual. And the world of the individual is not a world I want to live in.
Thank you so much, Earl, for that thought-provoking, inspiring talk. Thank you to the audience for being here and braving the vortex. But this is our downbeat to SphinxConnect 2019 Leaders Rising, and this is Motown. We dance. So up on the 4th floor, I look forward to seeing all of you to celebrate our first day and look forward to a productive tomorrow. Thanks so much for coming.